Please remain standing or stand in body or spirit for a reading from the Gospel of John. Now before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. And during supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God, was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with a towel that was tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus answered, "You do not know now what I am doing, but later you will understand." Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "One who has bathed does not need to wash, except for the feet, but is entirely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you." For he knew who was to betray him. For this reason he said, "Not all of you are clean." After he had washed their feet, had put on his robe, and returned to the table, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example, that you also should do as I have done to you. Very truly, I tell you, servants are not greater than their master, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them."
Live in charity and steadfast love. Live in charity. God will dwell with you. Live in charity and steadfast love. Live in charity. God will dwell with you.
A few years ago, Damon and I were at a concert with some of his friends who always fly out to Denver when the band Widespread Panic is playing at Red Rocks Amphitheater. This is a group of guys who has seen this band in venues all across the country, but Red Rocks is their favorite, except for the stairs. Sitting at 6,000 feet high, Red Rocks has two huge staircases that go from the lower parking lots up to the upper concession level. Each of those has about 380 steps. And then there are those interior stairways on either side of the bleachers. Those have about 138 steps apiece. And then there are those other side stairwells that go down to the restrooms. Some of those have 83 steps, some have 62 steps. You get the idea. It is a lot of going up and down just to get to the concert and get out, let alone how many times you decide to visit the concession stand or go to the restroom. Well, one night, a couple years ago, with these guys, we were all trying to make our way back to the car, and we found ourselves going up the stairway out of the seats at the venue, only then to go down the stairs to the upper handicapped parking lot, to then go up a few stairs to get to that different landing that then leads you down that long stairwell all the way down to the lower parking lot where we thought we were parked. Oops, wrong side. Let's just say there was a lot of going up and down that night. And at one point, as we were disagreeing about which way our car was parked and where we needed to go, someone said, it doesn't feel right that we're going upstairs yet again when we know that our car is parked down below. And it's at this point that our friend Pete just turned around and said, "Look, you got to go up to go down." Boom. You got to go up to go down. Sometimes things don't make sense on the surface, but that doesn't mean they're not true. Thank you, Pete. Somehow, in the midst of all the confusion about who Jesus was and what was about to happen to him, Jesus knew that he had to get up to get down with his disciples. That is, he had to get up from his seat at the table in order to get down onto his knees to wash their feet. He got up from his position as master and teacher to get down to the position of servant and student. Jesus got up from his seat at the table of privilege to get down to a position of serving. He got up from power to get down to love. In what is one of his most enduring lessons in John's gospel, Jesus teaches his disciples about love by saying, you gotta get up to get down. And by the way that Jesus' friend Peter reacted, no relation to Damon's friend Pete, by the way, that we know of, by the way Peter reacted, we can tell that this single act of getting up to get down was turning the table of their lives upside down, overturning the seating chart and social convention of the day. It made no sense to them. But this wasn't about logic. It was about love. So let's back up just a bit to get some context. John's gospel is essentially divided in two halves. The first 12 chapters of John covers 3 years of Jesus' public ministry. The last half, chapters 13 through 21, covers 24 hours. The last 24 hours of Jesus' life, the hour to which everything has been building, the hour of Jesus' death, his passion. To John, this hour is everything. At least it's worth half of his gospel. So perhaps we should slow down and pay attention to it, because we don't want this hour to be the one that we just spring forward over. That'll just leave us tired, but not taught. And there are lessons to be learned here. Something important to note is that this foot washing scene takes place before Passover, not during it. This is quite different than what we read in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And at this supper, there is no mention of bread and cup or the institution of the Last Supper. The very thing that we think is most central to the meal, the bread and the cup, it is missing in John's gospel. While the bread and the cup is central, perhaps, in remembering Jesus' life, John reminds us that love is most central in following Jesus' way of life. John turns the table on our idea of the Last Supper, showing us that it is not merely what we eat that matters, it's what we do that matters most. And nothing turns the tables of our comfort levels more upside down than foot washing. I know this not just from reading this text today, but from the attendance and participation at our foot washing services on Maundy Thursday. You know, these days we don't even have dirty feet because this time of year we're walking around in closed-toed shoes, not sandals. And most of us have showered at least in the last day or so. But never mind how sanitary our feet are or are not, having someone we might know touch our feet is vulnerable, exposing, uncomfortable. Our arthritic, bent hammer toes, our corns and our calluses, our chipped nails and swollen ankles, it is all a little much, isn't it? To be honest, we actually don't pay much attention to our feet, do we? Except when they're hurt, blistered or broken, or maybe when we splurge to get a pedicure or a massage. But in Jesus' day, foot washing was a rite of hospitality, and it was very common. As Becky said, people were walking on dusty roads all day wearing sandals. Dirty feet was a daily thing. And because of this, most houses had basins of water at the entrance. And the normal practice was for people just to wash their own feet when they entered a house. We saw this in Genesis 18 as the strangers came on the road to meet Abraham. And Abraham brought out a water basin under a tree and said, "Here, wash your feet while we get dinner ready." And this was the normal practice, self-foot washing. A variation on this is that if you could afford servants, you would have a servant wash the feet of your guests. I'm saying servant here, but the reality is slave is probably a better term. There's no indication that these individuals were being paid for their services or that they had a choice in the matter. But the larger point is that no free person would wash the feet of another free person. It just wasn't done. So this is an extraordinary gesture on Jesus' part. For Jesus to get up from his seat at the table during supper, not before it, just reinforces the attention he wants to give to this moment. Jesus, as the teacher and master of his friends and disciples, takes on the role of a servant or a slave. And he offers this gesture of humility, but without the brutal conditions of forced labor and dehumanization attached to it. He gets up from his seat at the table to get down on his knees to show us that the seat we need to be taking most often in life is one of serving others in love. Doing something that makes us uncomfortable for the sake of lifting someone else up. Jesus took a task that people normally did for themselves and said, "Let me do this for you. Let me show you my love." And sure, the act of washing dirt off of feet is an act of love, quite literally, right? It's helpful. But metaphorically, it's an act of love too. Because to hold feet, to wash feet, to tend to feet is to acknowledge where someone has been. To acknowledge where someone is standing right now and where they have dreams to go. How often do we have an opportunity to bless the journeys of one another? To acknowledge and to honor the path that someone has been on, the forks in the road that they've pondered and agonized over, and the trail that they're forging ahead now. And here's the kicker that makes this story even more powerful. This wasn't Jesus' idea. Just one chapter earlier, in John 12, Jesus' dear friend Mary does an extravagant and outlandish act. She takes costly perfume made of pure nard. Read expensive, right? She anoints and pours it over Jesus' feet and then uses her hair to wash and wipe his feet. The way John sequences these stories, the way John tells this story, is that Jesus decides to wash the feet of his disciples because of the feeling of love and respect and devotion that Jesus felt from Mary as she washed his feet. And he takes this extravagant act of love that's done to him first, a personal act, and he makes it simpler in terms of the supplies and materials, right? Here's some water in a basin. You don't need the nard or the perfume. But he makes it even more extravagant and outlandish in terms of the recipients of this gesture. Because you see, of course, Mary loved Jesus and was devoted to him. Of course, she would be willing to wash his feet. But Jesus was in a room of people who knew him, probably better than most people knew him, yet at least two of them were about to hurt him deeply. Peter would deny him, Judas would betray him. Neither understood him, and yet Jesus washed their feet too. Apparently, knowing people will hurt us is not a reason not to love them or serve them. Apparently, the kind of love Jesus came to teach us about is a love that is for all, for those who love us with devotion and those who hurt us with deception, those who listen to us and those who ignore us, those who understand us and those who misunderstand us. Let's be honest, this kind of love is hard to wrap our heads around, let alone our hearts. Peter, of course, is the one in this story who plays the role of all of us in these narratives. He just simply says out loud what we're all thinking in our heads. Lord, you can't wash my feet. You're the teacher. And Jesus, after a roundabout thing, essentially says, exactly, I'm the teacher. So look at me. This is your lesson for today. I serve you, and you must do the same for others. There's not a special seat at the table for some, but not for others. So if you find yourself in a position of honor or power or privilege, consider getting up out of that seat and kneeling on the floor, seeing how you can privilege somebody else in that moment, how you can bless them on their path, not boast in your own position or place in their presence. You gotta get up to get down. You can't serve and love others from the place where you always sit, from the position where you always are, from the perspective from which you always see. You have to get up from where you are to get down to discover something new. To love in this kind of way has nothing to do with elevating or demeaning ourselves, but everything to do with seeing another as an equal. Because the thing about washing somebody's feet is, if somebody's sitting in a chair and you kneel down, you're at eye level with them. You would have to work hard not to be at eye level with them, not to make eye contact. So this story is not just about demoting yourself in order to promote somebody else. That just plays into this false dichotomy of a hierarchy of power, right? That says some people are on top and others are on the bottom. No, this is about knocking down that ladder altogether and seeing all as equal, loving one another equally, even when the behavior that we are exhibiting or that someone else is exhibiting doesn't deserve our love. Deep breath here. You know what this passage has been making me think about all week? Washing Vladimir Putin's feet. It's kind of a repulsive thought, disturbing and disarming. Serving and loving one who is not just betraying and denying one person, as Peter and Judas did, but who is betraying and denying, attacking and murdering whole groups of innocent people. What does it mean to look into the eyes of one who seems to personify evil and humanize them? To show tenderness and care to them? Just imagining it is uncomfortable for me. Just thinking of holding the feet of somebody who is trampling on women and children and civilians and cities and soldiers, it's kind of more than I can handle. I invite you into this spiritual practice this week, and you can tell me about it, how it goes for you. But it's made me wonder, what if more people had shown Putin this kind of self-giving love in his life? Would he be the way he is now? I don't know. Maybe. But maybe not. Who am I to limit God's love with my judgment of who deserves it? And the thing is, Putin is an extreme example, right? Most of us are not going to have to worry about kneeling down before a person like Putin and washing his feet. No, our task is a little bit more mundane, but much more personal and perhaps more difficult. We have to think about what it means to kneel at the feet of somebody that we love who has betrayed us or denied us, hurt us or ignored us, someone who annoys us or angers us. Sometimes we have to think about what it means to draw boundaries and be safe from someone who is harming us without demonizing them or demoralizing them in the process. We have to condemn their actions without canceling out their humanity or dignity or their worth as a fellow human. And this is hard work, radical love kind of work, following Jesus kind of work, Christian kind of work. Getting up from our seat in order to get down onto the floor of those that we view as below us so many times is not easy. And if we think it is, may we just remember that right after this, within 24 hours, Jesus will be beaten, betrayed, crucified, and buried. This is not an act of love that Jesus is sugarcoating. It's all grit. Even though years later we look back on it and call it grace, I bet Judas's feet felt pretty gritty in Jesus' hands as he was washing them. As Jesus gets up from his place at the table to get down on his knees, to wash the feet of his betrayer and his denier, he reveals that there is no act of love that is off the table when it comes to how we are to act and live in the world, including how we let ourselves be loved. I want to conclude by sharing with you a passage from one of my favorite books. It's called Let Your Life Speak by Quaker Parker Palmer. And Parker Palmer writes in chapter 4 of this book about experiencing depression and how he really felt like he was pushed down to his limits of despair before he could rise up. And he couldn't rise up again without the help of others. And after sharing in this chapter about all the ways that people said things that they thought were helpful that really weren't, he said, one of the hardest things we must do is to be present to another's pain without trying to fix it. To simply stand respectfully at the edge of that person's mystery and misery. And standing there, yeah, we feel useless and powerless. But that's exactly how the depressed person feels. He talks about this friend of his named Bill, who would come over every day and would not say a word to him, but would just take off his socks and shoes and would massage his feet. Who would be present to him without words, but just acknowledged his humanity. He says, it's impossible to put into words what my friend's ministry meant to him, but it gave me a new understanding and appreciation for the stories of Jesus washing feet. Because this kind of love does not reflect the, quote, functional atheism that sometimes we practice, meaning we say pious words about God's presence in our lives, but we believe, on the contrary, that nothing good is going to happen unless we make it happen, right? All that self-reliance. Well, Parker Palmer says sometimes we just have to stand and witness someone's suffering and pain. It's a love in which we represent God's love to a suffering person, not trying to enter their pain or change it, but just to bear witness to us. You know, he reminds us that it's not about which posture we're in, as much as it is about ensuring that we're connecting with the person who is across from us. Jesus turns the tables of our lives by inviting us to get out of our seat, to get down to serve others, but only because he had been down being served by Mary first, which allowed him to get up again. Jesus gives us both models of extravagant love, giving and receiving, getting up to get down, getting down to get up. Both embody the love of Christ, and both will lead us more fully into the presence of one another. Amen.